good to have you back for another day of Bible study as we are continuing on through our journey through the Gospel of Mark. My name is Kevin. I have the privilege of being lead clergy here at Christ Table. If you'd like to know more about Christ Table, who we are, what we do, visit the URL that's right there, www.christstable.today. We are here primarily for those who are disconnected, disillusioned, or done with the church, who are on the margins of spiritual community and Christianity, but also many, many, many people who are happily plugged into a local church utilize us as a secondary discipleship opportunity, and we appreciate that and don't mind that at all. Now, if you'd like more information about this study in particular, then right there is where you need to go. go.christstable.today/journey. There's a reading list of all of the days of this study. Don't start at the very beginning. Just join us right where you are and continue on from here. And then if you want to start at the beginning, go back and start with us. Don't try to catch up. If you'd like more information about this study, a study guide to help you walk through each day of the study, there's one that's there at that URL, absolutely free. Feel free to download that. No strings attached. We give away as many resources as we can. But if you want to support Christ Table, then at that URL, you can get a box that will have a printed version of the study guide in there, as well as a map that follows Jesus through the Gospel of Mark and many other kind of tools and gifts in there to help you enjoy this journey through the Gospel of Mark. Now, we're journeying through this in a way that may be a little bit different to the way that you've done Bible study. It's called Lectio Divina. It's a contemplative practice where you contemplate the text and allow the Spirit of God to speak directly to you. There really aren't any right or wrong answers here. We're not trying to figure out theological nuances in these passages. We're simply just trying to say, what does God speak to us? What do we feel? How do these passages move us as we read them? You can Google that to find out more information about how to do that, or that URL is right there beneath me, go.christstable.today/journey. The study guide that's there walks you through that Lectio Divina process each and every day. Speaking of days, today is day 15 of the study out of 24, and we are throttling our way. We're now more than halfway through the Gospel of Mark. Today we find ourselves in Mark chapter 10, the first half of the gospel, the first half of the chapter of chapter 10, and Mark verses 1 through 31. And as we walk through this study, what I'm doing is essentially just kind of telling you some things that stood out to me. This isn't necessarily the most important things that are happening in the text each and every day. There are also, hopefully, not the least important things that are happening in the text each day. They're simply things that stood out to me as being intriguing, or where God spoke to me as I worked through the practice of Lectio Divina myself. You're going to come up with probably an entirely different list of things that stand out to you, that you meditate on, that you contemplate on, and that's okay. So there were a couple of things, and this is a very dense passage, and some of these are, and it's not as though we're trying to avoid the difficult sections or the dense parts of Scripture, but we're also saying we don't want to get bogged down in those when we're doing this specific Bible study practice. Now, this isn't the only way that we study the Bible or we look at it, so it's not as though we're ignoring or missing those things forever or intentionally. We're just saying that for our purposes of this study, we want the Spirit to speak directly to us. So if things aren't compelling, if things aren't fully understandable to us, that's actually okay in this process. Don't feel bad or like you're doing it wrong. You're not. So Jesus is confronted by some religious leaders, and firsthand, sometimes whenever these confrontations happen, we can take them to be negative interactions. And what we don't understand, and the difference between Christianity and Judaism, especially first century Judaism, is these are the style of interactions that happen. It is very much more about questions and conversations, and for lack of a better word, arguing, than it is simply about getting the right answer on the test every time when it comes to the theology. And so it is a relatively common occurrence and an acceptable pattern for Jesus, for rabbis, for religious leaders and teachers to be asked questions, to be given dilemmas, to be pressed on their ethics and how they are lived out from their perspective. Now, we also know that there were a contingent of people in first century Judaism who ultimately aren't a fan of some of the things that Jesus is teaching and saying, and utilize these questions and answers and conversations to try to trap him, But on the surface, oftentimes these can be taken at face value as simply arguing between people of the same faith who are trying to understand each other's perspectives. And it's not necessarily always about trying to find right or wrong. It's simply about trying to understand, because there can be more than one right answer in Judaism to these kinds of conversations. So the question is about divorce and about marriage and whether or not divorce is okay, and in the afterlife what's going to happen in that. And so this is a really big question in these days. So they ask Jesus his stance on divorce and from the Mosaic law what his stance is, and Jesus responds back to them, well, what did Moses say in the law about divorce? And they say, verse 4, well, he permitted it. He said that a man can give his wife written notice of divorce and he could send her away. So Moses permitted divorce under certain circumstances and through a specific process. And Jesus responds, well, he wrote this commandment only as a concession to your hard hearts. And this kind of stopped me, because essentially what's happening here is that the Mosaic law, the law from God, said to be given directly by God, was very specific about divorce. And yet Moses allows it in a very specific way. And Jesus here is changing Mosaic law, or saying that Mosaic law was essentially wrong, that the only reason that that was allowed was because of hard hearts, but that wasn't reflective of the heart of God. Now, this is fascinating because, many of us, let's avoid the Jewish implications of this, and let's just kind of look at the Christian current implications of this, is that, many people go back to the Old Testament law in order to mandate behavior for Christians today. Let's just go there. Some of the classic conversations about this involve Leviticus and homosexuality, the LGBTQ community using words like abomination from the Hebrew text. And so many people hang their hats on several of these texts, kind of like many people then and now hung their hats on divorce in the Mosaic law. And Jesus is essentially saying here, the Mosaic law was wrong. It wasn't reflective of the heart of God. Moses allowed it, but it was essentially a concession here. Whoo. Jesus is saying, wasn't what God wanted. Yeah, it's what's in the law, but it wasn't what God wanted. That really throws a wrench, right, in the system. Like, what if this weren't about divorce? What if this was about LGBTQ? What if this is the passage on abomination in the OT text? What if it's one of the ones in 1 Corinthians or in Romans, and Jesus is saying, nah. Yeah, you saw that in the law, but really that was just concession. It was not really reflective of the heart of God. It was just kind of necessary in that moment and in that time. And great wailing and gnashing of teeth. It kind of hit me between the eyes. Are all the ways in which I found and mandate my faith and my beliefs truly reflective of the heart of God? Or is it me kind of reading into these things, my heart, and forcing it to be the heart of God? Lots of different issues where I'm certain that happens with me, not just one or two. And then beyond that, it was a concession to your hard hearts. And as we've said, if you've been along this Bible study for any length of time, there is this recurring statement about hard hearts, specifically hard hearts among the disciples, or hard hearts among followers of Jesus, followers of God. We often think of people who don't follow God as having hard hearts, but here what we see in Mark is the people who are closest to Jesus, or closer closest to God, or the ones who are actually continually being brought up that they are the ones with the hard hearts. People who are outside of Christianity say this about us rather regularly, that some of the worst human beings are Christians. Your hard hearts. Hard hearts. Are your hearts hard? You see, this is a very important question. See, Mark continues to pose this, I think, not just as an explanation of what was going on here as we journey through the Gospel of Mark, but I think that Mark continues to pose this so that we will reflect on this question as to whether or not we have hard hearts, whether or not concessions are having to be made for me because of my hard heart, whether or not concessions are having to be made for you by God, by others, because of hard hearts. And we don't like to think of ourselves that way because it's always somebody else who has the hard heart, right? But what if, go with me here, what if it isn't somebody else who has the heart? What if it's you? What if it's me? If we're not willing to go there and ask that question legitimately of ourselves, then I think you could say we have the hard heart. I'm the one who has the hard heart. If I'm not willing to face the question or the possibility that I'm the one who may have a hard heart, not the other, I'm probably the one with a hard heart. This is something that I'm wrestling with in this passage as I walk through this process of Lectio Divina. So as we move through this, now we have this situation in the text as we read a little bit further where some individuals bring children to Jesus to receive a blessing. And this is a very common occurrence for children to be blessed. So parents are bringing their children so that he could touch them and bless them. But disciples scold the parents for bothering them, because the disciples are bought into the cultural idea that children have no worth or value, just like women have no value beyond property. We talk about marriage and, marriage in the Bible. Well, marriage in the Bible, oh my gosh, did you know anything about marriage in biblical times? When we're property, it's a patriarchy. They're sold to the man in exchange for money, for livestock, for oil. We don't understand truly biblical marriage. Biblical marriage is nothing like marriage today in any way, shape, or form. Children, property, had no standing, weren't even really seen until they reached the age of maturity, the bar mitzvah, the bat mitzvah, as really having any value or voice. They weren't seen as having potential. This idea of the importance or the value of all life really just doesn't translate well into these biblical contexts. So the disciples essentially are here saying, your time is better spent with more valuable people, more prominent people, with men. If women, children want to be around, great, but this is a better use of your time. Now, all of that aside, what we see here, and I think this is fascinating, is that Jesus was angry with his disciples. And it's not so much the theology or the practical nature of what goes on here that really kind of stopped me in my tracks as I was doing my reading through this text, but it is this response of Jesus' anger in this moment. It's such a strong word. It's such a deep emotion, even one that many times growing up, I was told Christians aren't supposed to be angry. And yet here, Jesus is angry in a situation that simply doesn't seem to call for Jesus to be angry. So what is going on here? Why is he feeling this emotion? Why is he so angry that this has happened? And what does that have to do with me? What does that have to do with you? I think that as you read through the text today, maybe you will do what I did and contemplate and sit with that emotion for a while, that anger. Were there other times, can I remember other times where Jesus has been angry? If so, what were they? If not, well, why not? What about me? When is my anger resurrected from within? When is it not? What are the common threads in those moments where I am angry? And what is the commonality between those moments when I'm not angry? And how do I compare my anger or lack of anger with Jesus' anger or lack of anger? And what do I learn when I do that? Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Look forward to being back with you tomorrow as we continue on in this Journey Bible study. But until tomorrow, happy reading.